Newspeak. That is the 14th of 14 characteristics of Ur-Fascism by Umberto Eco. We made it, y'all. We're on the last one. Let's get into it. 14. Ur-Fascism speaks Newspeak. Newspeak was invented by Orwell in 1984 as the official language of Ingsoc, English socialism. But elements of Ur-Fascism are common to different forms of dictatorship. All the Nazi or fascist schoolbooks made use of an impoverished vocabulary and an elementary syntax in order to limit the instruments for complex and critical reasoning. But we must be ready to identify other kinds of newspeak, even if they take the apparently innocent form of a popular talk show. So what is newspeak? In the dystopian novel, 1984, also published as 1984. And I just want to say, y'all, I actually read 1984 for the first time in 1984, which was such a trip. It was written by George Orwell. Newspeak is the fictional language of Oceania, a totalitarian superstate. To meet the ideological requirements of Ingsoc or English socialism in Oceania, the party created Newspeak, which is a controlled language of simplified grammar and limited vocabulary, designed to limit a person's ability for critical thinking. The Newspeak language thus limits the person's ability to articulate and communicate abstract concepts such as personal identity, self-expression, and free will, which are thought crimes, acts of personal independence that contradict the ideological orthodoxy of Ingsoc collectivism. In the appendix of the novel, The Principles of Newspeak, Orwell explains that Newspeak follows most rules of English grammar, yet is a language characterized by a continually diminishing vocabulary. Complete thoughts are reduced to simple terms of simplistic meaning. The political contractions of Newspeak, Ingsoc for English socialism, Minitru for Ministry of Truth, Mini-Plenty for Ministry of Plenty, are similar to Nazi and Soviet contractions in the 20th century, such as Gestapo for Geheim Staatspolizei, Politburo for Political Bureau of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Comintern for Communist International, Kolthoz for Collective Farm, and Komsomol for Communist Youth Union. Newspeak contractions usually are syllabic abbreviations meant to conceal the speaker's ideology from the speaker and the listener. Let's hear a little bit of the Newspeak of 2025.
Drill, baby, drill.
From the fake news.
Is a total witch hunt.
Alternative facts to that. But
We gave alternative facts. Just alternative facts. Okay, so essentially, in the book 1984, people were discouraged from thinking critically, from thinking in abstract, and thinking anything outside of the prescribed way of thinking that was given to them by their government. And what ended up happening was, as the language diminished, the ability for people to think critically diminished alongside it. So we're going to look at it in Open Culture, which is a website that kind of collects a bunch of articles from different perspectives and different thought. We're going to read this, parts of this from, who wrote this? I don't know who wrote it. We'll see when we get to the bottom. Anyway, it's called George Orwell Explains How Newspeak Works, the official language of his totalitarian dystopia in 1984. As we noted yesterday, and you likely noticed elsewhere, George Orwell's classic dystopian novel, 1984, shot to the top of the charts or the Amazon bestseller list in the wake of alternative facts, which we just heard Kelly Conway say. I think that was the first time that it was used. And people were like, what the fuck are we talking alternative facts? And part of the problem is, if we cannot agree on the basic set of facts, then we cannot then we can't even have conversations about how to solve problems or how to think about things, because we have to agree on the facts in order to then move further into problem solving. So alternative facts, which just basically means here, the latest Orwellian coinage for bald-faced lying. The ridiculous phrase immediately produced a barrage of parodies, hashtags, and memes, healthy ways of venting rage and disbelief. Because truly, what comes from this alternative facts universe is rage and disbelief. We can't communicate with each other, and it is infuriating. But maybe there's a danger there too, letting such words sink into the discourse, lest they become what Orwell called newspeak. It's easy to hear newspeak, the official language of Oceania, as newspeak. This is perfectly reasonable, but it gives us the impression that it relates strictly to its appearance in mass media. Orwell obviously intended the ambiguity. It is the language of official propaganda, after all. But the portmanteau actually comes from the words new speak, and it has been created to supersede old speak. Orwell writes, or standard English, as we should call it. In other words, newspeak isn't just a set of buzzwords, but the deliberate replacement of one set of words in the language for another. The transition is still in progress in the fictional 1984, but it is expected to be completed by about the year 2050. Students of history and linguistics will recognize that this is a ludicrously accelerated pace for the complete replacement of one vocabulary and syntax by another. We might call Orwell's English socialists accelerationists. Newspeak appears not through history or social change, but through the will of the party. And this is a quote from the book. The purpose of Newspeak was not only to provide a medium of expression for the worldview and mental habits proper to the devotees of Ingsoc, but to make all other modes of thought impossible. It's entirely plausible that alternative facts or alt-facts would fit right into the 9th and 10th editions of the Newspeak dictionary, though it might easily fall out of favor and be suppressed later. No telling if it would make the cut for the final perfected version of Newspeak as embodied in the 11th edition of the dictionary. These quotations come not from the main text of 1984, but from an appendix called The Principles of Newspeak, which you can hear at the top of the post, and I will link this post if you want to go and listen to a reading of the appendix. Here, Orwell dispassionately discusses the perfected form of Newspeak, including its grammatical peculiarities, such as an almost completely interchangeability between different parts of speech, an issue current translators have encountered. He then introduces its vocabulary divided into 3 distinct classes, A, B, and C. The A class contains everyday life words that have been mutated with cumbersome prefixes and intensifiers. Uncold for warm, plus cold, and double plus cold for very cold, and superlatively cold. Now this I find incredibly fascinating because there is a world over on the tickety-tock that there are words that just you cannot say in lives because TikTok has such an advanced and sophisticated algorithm that there are words that if you say on the TikTok live, you're very likely to get your live banned or your entire account banned. So if you are over in the TikTok world, you probably use words like unalived instead of dead, or intentionally unalived, or self-unalived for suicide, because you can't say that either, or terrorist for terrorist, or what's the other one that I like? Oh, a P3DO instead of pedophile. So we've already, in some spheres of our discourse, started to use like newspeak words to get around the bans. The B class contains the compound words, sinister doublethink coinages like joy camp for a forced labor camp, and mini-pox, and pox means peace, for Ministry of Peace, which is actually, in fact, the Ministry of War. These, Orwell explains, are similar to the characteristic features of political language in totalitarian countries of the early 20th century. I'm going to skip this next paragraph. You can go back and read it if you want. The C class of words may be the most insidious of all. While it consisted entirely of scientific and technical terms that resembled the scientific terms in use today, the party took care to define them rigidly and strip them of undesirable meanings. For example, there was no vocabulary expressing the function of science as a habit of mind or a method of thought, irrespective of its particular branches. There was indeed no word for science, any meaning that it could possibly bear being already sufficiently covered by the word ingsoc. So essentially, in 1984, in ingsoc, in Newspeak, science and ingsoc were interchangeable words. Because think about this. If you eliminate language for science, if you withdraw people from thinking about science, then it's much easier to control their thinking, to reduce their ability to think critically and to grow. Science is a diversity of thought. Science, the best discoveries of science come when you get diverse opinions, diversity of thought, diversity of ideas and methodologies. You bring those all together, and what comes out of that is this progression of science, of medicine, of health. But if you want to control your people, you need to remove science and scientific thought from the discourse.
In addition to pulling out of the World Health Organization, the Trump administration has frozen communications by many federal health agencies, including public health updates, and canceled upcoming meetings of the National Institutes of Health and other agencies.
Okay, so, I mean, it's really kind of terrifying, honestly, but we are already seeing this kind of in the United States, this withdrawal of science and scientific words from the language. We saw a lot of this during the COVID pandemic, and the newspeak that was being just vomited all over the news media of the time. It was disgusting. And what ended up happening was a lot of people died because they were leaning into trusting the government over trusting science. Science and the government were not communicating well at the time. This is why everybody wanted to do away with Anthony Fauci, who, by the way, was one of the most brilliant minds that this country has ever had the pleasure of utilizing. Anthony Fauci was almost primarily responsible for the halting of the AIDS epidemic being a death sentence for people. To claim that he was anything other than one of the most brilliant minds we've ever had is just blasphemy. It's just blasphemy. Anyway, one last paragraph here. Orwell then goes on to discuss the difficulty of translating the work of the past into newspeak. He uses as an example the Declaration of Independence. All mans are equal was a possible newspeak sentence, but only in that it expressed a palpable untruth, for example, that all men are of equal size, weight, or strength. As for the rest of Thomas Jefferson's rousing preamble, it would have been quite impossible to render this into newspeak, writes Orwell. The nearest one could come to doing so would be to swallow the whole passage up in the single word, crime think. What Orwell is saying here is that the Declaration of Independence is in itself such a progression of thought and critical thinking that in Newspeak and ingsoc, you wouldn't have been able to translate it. It would have just been crime think. It would have been criminal to think in the way that the Declaration of Independence encouraged. So I wanted to do just a little quick aside here. This is a map of the world of 1984. And what we see here is that the United States has actually become Oceania, which includes Canada and Mexico and South America. It also has parts of South Africa and Australia, and a parts of Britain over here as well. That is one power in the world. The second power in this fictional world is Eurasia, which is basically all of Europe and Asia, or Russia put together. And then I want to see the third one, which is in yellow. There it is, disputed territories. Okay. Is East Asia. And that is this clump over here. Now, all of this in light gray in this fictional world is disputed territory. So the world, even in 1984, it's not all settled yet. Like, they are still kind of having a battle over who is going to control this. But what I found the most fascinating is that there's a school of thought right now that what Trump and Putin and Xi Jinping are trying to do, what China, Russia, and America are trying to do, is to consolidate into essentially three superpowers. Y'all, I'm just saying. If this is the world that we want, then we should continue on the current trajectory. I'm just not sure that it is the world that we want, but I digress. Okay, next up is this is a clip from a movie. This is an incredible movie. It's called Arrival. It's back from 2016. And the whole entire movie premise is about learning the language of a non-human. So these aliens that come to Earth. And there's a school of thought that suggests that if you can learn another culture's language, you then will start to think in the way that the people of that culture think. That learning the language itself literally changes the way that you think and process the world. And so this movie also is, they're talking with an alien species that does not think or speak linearly. So our language is very linear. Right? Like, we have one word comes after the next word, and you can see it on the page of a book. It's very linear. But these aliens do not speak linearly. And so as this scientist or linguist starts to learn their language, her thinking starts to shift. It's just fascinating. But what I want to play for you is this clip where she's describing where all of the countries of the world are learning the language of these aliens using different methodologies. And it is going to become problematic because they're not all interpreting what these aliens are saying in the same way. So let's just take a listen.
Mobilized forces, and now Russia's following suit.
Shang's about to start something.
Following suit, suits. Suits, honor, flowers. Colonel, those are all tile sets in mahjong. God, are they using a game to converse with their heptapods?
Maybe. Why?
Well, let's say that I taught them chess instead of English. Every conversation would be a game, every idea expressed through opposition, victory, defeat. You see the problem? If all I ever gave you was a hammer,
Everything's a nail.
So what she is talking about is that the way that we use language has everything to do with how we interact with one another and how we show up in the world. So I want to read this article from Vanity Fair. And this was a fairly new article, February 19th. So it is really new. So Molly Jong-Fast she's brilliant. And I'm not going to lie, She uses words in this article that I had to look up. And I know a lot of words. But it's just, let's get into it. It's fascinating, her take on Trump world's war on words. The administration's attack on the AP, and in case you've been sleeping under a rock, Trump's administration has kicked out AP News. And AP News was considered one of the most, if not the most, bipartisan, accurate news reporting organizations. And all of the other news organizations use the AP News to gather data, which they then can use to write their stories. So when you kick out the AP News and you're essentially kicking out the most respected and the most relied upon news organization, then what happens is all of the other pieces and parts start to kind of fall apart. And what they can do then is put into place news reporting that's not really news reporting that uses alternative facts. And when you start to do that, then you start to control the thoughts and the minds of the masses. The administration's attack on the AP, along with efforts to rewrite history and reframe reality, only reaffirms the maxim that language is power. The right-wing war on all things woke has relied on a critical weapon, language. Trump world's culture war arsenal may contain many things, a flurry of social media posts and videos, an army of sympathetic media propagandists, but all of these tools rely on language. It feels ironic to talk about the importance of language in MAGA's rhetoric when Donald Trump uses so many malapropisms and shorthands to convey his ideas. Think of the weave, his tendency to tack back and forth between completely different ancillary topics when speaking in public. Let's listen to the weave, shall we?
You know what the wave is? I'll talk about like 9 different things and they all come back brilliantly together. And it's like, and friends of mine that are like English professors, they say, it's the most brilliant thing I've ever seen.
No one said that.
But the fake news, you know what they say? You rambled. That's not rambling. When what you do is you get off a subject to mention another little tidbit, then you get back onto the subject, and you go through this, and you do it for 2 hours, and you don't even mispronounce one word.
That is Donald Trump telling a crowd in Pennsylvania the other day, rambling incoherently, actually part of a brilliant strategy he calls the weave.
Okay. I mean, it's also gaslighting. And I will do another video another time about the gaslighting that is happening. But essentially, gaslighting is telling you that what you saw was not really what you saw, or what you thought was not really what you thought. That's what gaslighting is. What he's saying is that, this rambling blah, 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 that makes no sense. It's not really what you think. It's not rambling. It's not me losing my place. It's the weave. It's intentional. But while Trump may not be particularly careful about every word or any word, really, his administration and allies are laser focused on their intrinsic power. They've used phrases like biological reality and maiming to dispute transgender people's existence and rail against gender reassignment surgery. They've disingenuously used words like energy emergency to ramp up offshore drilling. One of Trump's early executive orders combated non-existent censorship, in actuality a catch-all term for any effort to combat the misinformation and disinformation propagated by Trump and his allies. Now, the Trump administration has barred the Associated Press from the Oval Office and Air Force One because the esteemed news agency will not follow the president's executive order and refer to the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America. According to Axios, this is just one of MAGA's frustrations with the AP style book. The AP has its own style book. People follow and this is like how you do your punctuation or which contractions you use, or like there's a whole style book. The AP has its own style book. And the National Park Service, seemingly at the direction of Trump's anti-gender ideology executive order, has deleted all mentions of transgender and queer people from the Stonewall National Monument's websites, a Stalinesque erasure of the T and Q in LGBTQ, despite their crucial role in early queer rights movements. The Stonewall National Monument is a monument for gay and lesbian and queer and transgender and non-binary people. That's literally what it is. And that is here. And guess what? LGBTQ plus is now just LGB. So let's look. By the time of Stonewall, we had 50 to 60 gay groups in the country. A year later, 1,500. Before the 1960s, almost everything about living openly as a lesbian, gay, bisexual person was illegal. LGB. Already on the website because it's a .gov website. The Stonewall Uprising on June 28, 1969 is a milestone in the quest for LGB civil rights and provided momentum for a movement. We are going backwards, y'all. Literally on the website that honors the forward movement of LGBTQIA plus communities, they have removed everything aside from L and G and B. Fuck. Trump and his allies understand the power of words, and his administration is quickly becoming one that's obsessed with perverting their meaning. George Orwell reminded us of the political power of language in 1984 by using two different, very complementary ideas. Newspeak, a euphemism for the heavily simplified language of propaganda, and doublethink, one example of which is freedom is slavery, a phrase similar to Arbeit macht frei, translated to work makes one free, infamously used by Nazi Germany. Those concepts ring heavily in Trump's executive order titled Prioritizing Military Excellence and Readiness. That is also worth a read. The name belies the fact that the order bans trans people from serving in the U.S. military and prohibits the use of identification-based pronouns in the Department of Defense. This just came out. Basically, they're saying trans people can no longer serve. And their justification is by saying that because a trans person is just because they're trans, because they have gender dysphoria, which would, like the dysphoria itself is a medical term, right? So by calling trans people with gender dysphoria, what they're saying is that the very nature of being trans makes you mentally unwell. And if you have gender dysphoria and you're mentally unwell, you are mentally unfit to serve in the military. So people who not only have undergone gender-affirming treatments and surgeries, but anybody who even has symptoms that resemble the gender dysphoria are barred from service. How does banning trans people prioritize excellence? How does abolishing identification-based pronouns figure into readiness? The Trump executive order abolishing diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI initiatives in the military is called Restoring America's Fighting Force. What exactly is being restored? Does a pre-1960s army somehow fight better than a post-1960s army? None of these questions actually matter to Trump world because precision of language isn't the point. It's just overly simplistic propaganda. And then there's Trump worlds retaking the word democracy for their own purposes. Elon Musk told a Pennsylvania town hall crowd in October that the people who say Trump is a threat to democracy are themselves a threat to democracy. Sounds like doublethink to me. The Ministry of Peace being actually the Ministry of War. Musk spends a lot of time tweeting about democracy, but such posts seem to intentionally twist the meaning of the word to fit his own needs. For example, when a judge temporarily blocked his and Trump's early actions, Musk tweeted last week that democracy in America is being destroyed by judicial coup. An activist judge is not a real judge. 2 days later, he tweeted, "If any judge anywhere can stop every presidential action everywhere, we do not live in a democracy." Literally, that's what democracy is. Checks and balances. It's the ability for a judge to say, whoa, hold on now. Slow the roll. Not sure what you're doing is entirely legal. From a simple Twitter search of Musk's username and the word democracy, it becomes evident that when the world's richest man says something or someone is threatening democracy, he really just means it's something he doesn't like. The Trump administration has also worked hard to replace our traditional political lexicon with contradictory doublethink. As Sean McCreesh wrote in the New York Times, an entire lexicon of progressive terminology nurtured by the last administration has been squelched. Words like patriotism, see patriotic education, freedom, and a favorite of the far-right anti-American are frequently deployed in ways that mean their opposite. The phrase un-American was a key buzzword of McCarthyism, a movement that, just like Trumpism, targeted intellectuals and academics, including my grandfather Howard Fast. The central premise was that communism was so profoundly corrosive that if communists were allowed to write movies or books or magazine articles, they would have a Svengali-like influence over the reading public, forcing them to ditch capitalism. This administration seems to view DEI as a similar catch-all for ideas they don't like. Washington Post fact-checker Glenn Kessler wrote about Trump world's dishonest relationship with words and phrases like transparency while firing multiple inspectors general whose job literally is to make sure that there is transparency in their departments. Free speech, despite the censorious nature of their edicts, like you can't, there's so many words they're banning from use. And deficit, which Trump's desired tax cuts would only increase. Kessler also noted how the Trump administration, including Musk's Doge, seems to call policies it doesn't agree with fraud, when that is not what the word fraud means. Even the Atlantic's conservative columnist, Thomas Chatterton Williams, admits that Trump world is at war with the English language, utilizing the tools of censorship while somehow also claiming the mantle of free speech warriors. Most of the banned words related to gender and diversity, and this time the rules had the force of the government behind them. Williams wrote, "The compelled politesse of the left has been swapped out for the reflexive and gratuitous disrespect of the right. This checks out when you compare the careful, halting, almost fearful language of many Democratic elected officials versus the strident, giddily hostile language of many Republicans." And this, last week there was a meme going around that as Trump and Musk were, and continue to be, systematically obliterating the systems of government before our very eyes, taking a blowtorch to everything, the Democrats are going to respond with a sternly worded letter. Because the Democrats are more concerned about getting it right than they are about being effective. But anyone who thinks Trump Trump isn't at war with language, with words and their meanings, should look no further than a world map. There's reason to think that Trump's Gulf of America name change is about more than just asserting American primacy in the region. It could also speak to his larger ambitions, his quest to rewrite parts of history. After all, Republicans have long been at war with history, trying to mute and soften the teaching of America's original sin, slavery, and using book bans to prevent certain stories from being told. It may seem odd that language has taken such a central role in an administration that seems so slapdash, but it makes sense. Trump ran an attack ad that used the line, "Kamala is for they, them, Donald Trump is for you." It was, of course, misleading. Prisons under Trump offered gender-affirming care, which the campaign was then criticizing Harris for supporting. But it didn't matter, because the language was effective. It was just a few words summing up Trump's ethos by dumbing it down to, "Other people are coming for your stuff." This is written by the brilliant Molly Jong-Fast, special correspondent for Vanity Fair here. The Center for Progressive Reform wrote a blog post recently, not recently actually, this is from December of 2017, but it does talk about some of the language shifts, the language changes that Trump instituted in his first administration. So Winston Smith is from 1984. This article starts with a quote from Winston Smith, the main character. "You don't grasp the beauty of the destruction of words. Do you know that Newspeak is the only language in the world whose vocabulary gets smaller every year?" Donald Trump has never been known for the breadth of his vocabulary. In his case, I've always assumed that was a marker of not a particularly curious mind. The guy's openly contemptuous of higher education. He says he doesn't read books because he gets what he needs to know from watching the shows. When speaking, he likes to repeat things, uttering the same short sentence or phrase 2 or 3 times in the same breath, presumably for emphasis. And his word choices won't be adding to anyone's vocabulary. He uses very, very often, for example, and very, very, very frequently too. Now we learn that the president and his team want to limit everyone else's vocabulary as well, starting with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, and other agencies within the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, the scientific community, who thrives on diversity of thought. Friday, Lena H. Sun and Juliet Eilperin of the Washington Post reported, policy analysts at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta were told of the list of forbidden terms at a meeting Thursday with senior CDC officials who oversee the budget, according to an analyst who took part in the 90-minute briefing. The forbidden terms are vulnerable, entitlement, diversity, transgender, fetus, evidence-based, and science-based. They can't use those words at the White House. The next day, Sun and Eilperin reported that the word scrubbing would extend to other divisions of HHS. A second HHS agency received similar guidance to avoid using entitlement, diversity, and vulnerable, according to an official who took part in a briefing earlier in the week. Participants at that agency were also told to use Obamacare instead of ACA or the Affordable Care Act, which has been incredibly effective. There were people who voted for Trump in 2024 who were perfectly fine to get rid of that damned Obamacare, so long as we got to keep the Affordable Care Act. Who's going to tell them? And to use exchanges instead of marketplaces to describe the venues where people can purchase health insurance. Because everybody has access to a marketplace, but only rich, smart people have access to exchanges. So if you have exchanges in the health marketplace, in the health care system, it becomes inaccessible to people who don't know what that means. It's one thing to have a house writing style and to impose a certain amount of consistency across an entire department. We use serial commas on CPR blog, for example, and we're holding out against using the US instead of the United States, except as a modifier. But as usual, the Trump administration is going to extremes with the plain goal of denying or obscuring reality. And I will say, one of the new words that is forbidden to be used anywhere in the White House is felon. It's hard not to think of George Orwell when you read these kinds of stories. In 1984, he wrote about Big Brother's efforts to shrink the language as a way to diminish the range of thought possible. Old speak, with all its complex thoughts and disturbingly descriptive words, was a danger to the ruling class. Newspeak was lean and limited, perfect for a government intent on rewriting history at will and suppressing subversive ideas before they could even be formed in a single mind. 1984 returned to the bestseller list earlier this year, and not for nothing. The president's hostile relationship with facts, his coterie of liars on the public payroll, his insistence that CNN is making up news rather than reporting it, these are all stepping stones toward Orwell's vision of a totalitarian future. We're also accustomed to the rat-a-tat-tat of the political back and forth that it's easy not to notice when lines are crossed, even by a president famous for crossing lines. But let's take note of this one. This week, the President of the United States tried to shrink our vocabulary by banning the government's use of 7 words that he thinks lead to ideas that inconvenience him. We may not be in room 101 yet, but in some days it feels like it's just down the hall. And that is also a reference to 1984. If you want, go read 1984. It's a quick read, but incredibly timely right now. Now, I want to take a real quick look here at a doctor who is talking about the words that Trump has just banned. Just recently banned, and we'll take a look.
Another day, another list of banned words that the Trump administration says scientists can no longer use. This time as it relates to the National Science Foundation, which is an organization that funds research throughout the world. Employees at the National Science Foundation were given a list of words that would flag any research project. And if those words were used in the context of quote-unquote DEI research, they had to be removed entirely. And if not removed, then the grants funding those research projects could be modified or terminated entirely. A list of the flagged words: advocacy, anti-racist, disability, diversity, equity, ethnicity, gender, hate speech, historically, implicit bias, institutional, intersectional, male-dominated, marginalized, minority, oppression, racially, segregation, socioeconomic, trauma, underrepresented, underserved, victims, and women.
Women.
One researcher says that a paper on endometriosis has already been removed because at the end of the paper they discuss how trans men and people who identify as non-binary could still suffer from endometriosis and how this diagnosis is often overlooked in this population and leads to poor outcomes. But because that's considered woke radical gender ideology, they can no longer publish research based on that. And as a doctor, just as a human being with a soul, this fucking pisses me off. Because no matter how hard Donald Trump and his MAGA toadies try to erase trans people from the narrative, they're not going anywhere. Trans people have always existed, they currently exist, and they always will exist. And trans people, just like you, just like me, they need access to evidence-based medical care. They need access to culturally competent medical providers who will be able to take care of them. And banning research into healthcare for this vulnerable population is only going to lead to more harm and suffering to actual human beings, which, for the whole pro-life crowd out there, y'all are real silent on this one. This is not normal. This is not normal. We cannot view this as just run-of-the-mill crazy shit that Donald Trump does. This is bad, And as medical providers, as healthcare workers, we need to be advocating for trans people. We need to be fighting against this. We can't just take this lying down. And I'm not going to, and I hope you won't either. Have a great day.
Okay, so part of the problem with this diminishing of language, this banning of words that you can even use to describe what's going on in the real world where the rest of us live, is that it becomes really difficult then to actually function in those spheres. I have a sister who is a scientist, a brilliant scientist, and she told me the other day that all of the medical papers that describe research use the word bias, because you have to recognize the biases of the researchers in order to then properly interpret what the research is saying. You have to understand that. So there's a discussion in her circles right now of whether they should be using a different word. I mean, a lot like the way that we use unalived instead of dead, but it's not the same word, right? Another word that is replacing the word bias is not as specific. It's not going to convey the exact message that we want to get across. So she's actually pushing for people to just be like, y'all, fuck y'all, we're going to use the word bias. But there is some danger in that. There was I think it was a school district fairly recently that had a program that was federally funded for disabled youth who were transitioning from high school into adulthood. This program helped these young people transition into adulthood. And the program's funding was cut because the program used the word transition. And even though the program had nothing at all to do with transitioning of a gender, the very fact that they used the word meant that they got their funding cut. So this is bad. This is really bad. This is a terrifying final move. Now, we've gone through all 14 of these. We've gone through all 14 characteristics of your fascism that was laid out and identified by Umberto Eco. And there is evidence that every single one of the 14 characteristics is being utilized in the current Trump administration. And it is terrifying. And if you do go back and read the book 1984 and you realize that that is where we are headed, it is utterly horrifying. One of the reasons that I wanted to come on and start a YouTube channel to kind of like flesh these things out and take a look. And one of my goals is to actually take a look at some of the words that we use, like communism and socialism and apartheid, and actually look at what those words actually mean rather than what they've been what they've turned into. I'm going to take a look at DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, all of which are really good things for us. But the fact that the word DEI or the acronym has been hijacked to mean something completely different from what it originally meant is harming people now. It is actively harming people for whom DEI was necessary for them to even have opportunities to access the same things that the rest of us do. So it's not nothing. It's actually incredibly harmful. And the fact that we've got all 14 of these in the government right now, it is utterly horrifying. Now, I am snarky positivity, which means I always end on a positive note. And my positive note for today is this. We still have the ability to laugh. No one has yet taken away the ability for us to laugh at these things. And I really, truly believe that sometimes you have to laugh or you will cry. I have to laugh or I will cry. So we're going to end these 14, and I'm going to do a little bit of a wrap up tomorrow, just kind of taking a look at the big picture of these 14. But today, because we were talking about Newspeak and we were talking about the hijacking of the language, we are going to end on this.
I know words. I have the best words. In 1870, President Ulysses S. Grant, that beautiful Orion space capsule, the combat infantryman badge of our nation as a sovereign country. A lot of work has been done, a lot of renovation. If you look at some of it, defensive missions and missiles, your devotion, prowess, then you will gain momentum. Heroin alone, if you look at the heroin epidemic, the federal government is conducting an aggressive investigation. And to delegitimize, as bad as it is, it meant something by an anonymous, really anonymous. You're going to see some statistics coming out. Americans of all walks of life rose up. Assistant Secretary Girard and Surgeon General Adams, heart, lung, and liver transplants annually. Advising lawmakers, but China's their supply chain. This Russia thing with Trump, I hope they now go and take a look at the oranges of the investigation, the beginning. And every single car out there, even the really expensive ones. And we used to have Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Europe. The Nazis, the invasion of Normandy, and the liberation of Europe. A brilliant star shone in the east, wise men traveled far. Really big beneficiaries. Whole state to be a sanctuary for criminals. To shield and shelter criminal. Look, wait. The members of our armed forces, and you understand that very well. And the internet, if you think about this, rich traditions of this convention. Expectations in the House for the midterm and midterm year. Waive all applicable state taxes despite these obstacles, Karen. The Central Command response and crisis response. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt as Hurricane Irma approaches. And he voted for Obama amnesty by a sleazebag lawyer named Abiante. That's what the United Nations is all about. Will not be tolerated any longer. Merry Christmas, everybody. We just have to say it. You know, we just set another stock rocket. You saw that, right? The stock market. And to replace chasms of distrust ever foisted upon the American people. And then they announced there was no buys, no. Seek real bipartisan solutions. Made a pivotal, really, and I mean this was pivotal. Reauthorized the 9/11 victims. In April of 2014, our Army manned the air. It ran the ramparts. These historic accomplishments changed our embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. It's great to be back in Missouri, Ghana, Guinea, Nambia,
Nigeria,
Venezuela's working to improve this country and your terrific government. And God bless the United States. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Georgia. Okay, so to be fair, I stumble over my words a lot too, but damn! That's a great way to end this horrifying regime. We will continue to laugh. We will continue to stand up. We will continue to speak using words or words. You know, I have lots of words. We're gonna continue to use our words to make a difference. And that is why we are here, kiddos. Whew, Lordy. Thank you for hanging with me. If you like the content, please subscribe. I'm working to build up my subscriber base, and like and comment, because I would love to hear what kinds of things you want to learn about now that we've gotten through all 14 characteristics of your fascism. What do you want to know about now? I've got a whole list, but I would love to hear what you want to know. Thank you again. I am Snarky Positivity. Okay, bye.